like to ask you something. How many of you grew up in a big city? Can you please show your hands? Okay. And how many of you grew up in the countryside? Okay, thank you. So the majority here tonight grew up in a big city. There is a study from the University of Heidelberg in Germany that shows that when experiencing a stressful situation, those who grew up in a big city reacted in a different way compared to those who grew up in a rural environment. Specifically, the research shows that the brain activity of the participants of this study changed according to the environment they came from. Now, the reasons for this are multiple and complex, but first, let's go back in time for a moment. 120 years ago, in 1903, a German sociologist named Georg Simmel wrote the book The Metropolis and the Mental Life. In this book, Simmel looked at life in big cities, describing them as a very crowded and economically developed environment that makes the individual constantly overstimulated. The fast pace of work, pollution, traffic jams, deadlines, noises and lights of all kinds, people everywhere all the time. According to Simmel, this constant flood of stimulation does something to us. It makes our minds overloaded. And since we as humans are by nature sensitive animals, in order to protect ourselves, we shut down, we become detached, we become indifferent, what Simmel describes as the blasé attitude. He also sees money as the symbol of the modern age. Everything becomes measurable, quantifiable, and this also affects the idea that we have of life, which becomes more quantitative than qualitative. In this capitalistic view of society, this also affects our self-perception in terms of success and productivity, and also the idea that we have of others. According to Simmel, in fact, the social bonds that are born in big cities are deeply affected by the economic value that we see in each other, by the position on the social ladder and wealth that attack the authenticity of social interactions. What Simmel described 120 years ago still resonates today. In fact, many of his ideas still echo in the work of contemporary thinkers like the Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han. Han describes our time as the burnout society. According to Han, post-industrialization and capitalism have given rise to a society characterized by an overabundance of stimuli, obsessed with productivity when value is measured in numbers, how busy, how successful, how efficient you are. In this world, we're constantly immersed in what philosophers call the vita activa, the active life, where doing and achieving never stops. What we have lost is vita contemplativa, the quiet life of reflection, contemplation, and even boredom. Now think about it. Today, success often looks like working 80 hours per week. When they ask us, how is it going? And we say, I'm so busy with work. The answer is often, well, it's good. If you're busy, it means you're doing well. So when we have nothing to do, we feel like we're wasting our time. When we are bored, we feel like we are being unproductive. So the result of all this, according to Han, as for Simmel, is an intensification of the nervous life. And today, in the 21st century, we clearly see it in the rise of mental disorders such as ADHD, anxiety, burnout, depression, and the feeling of loneliness. I come from Milan, in Italy, and recently it was described as the city of singles. And that's because 57% of households in Milan is composed of only one person. Now you might be thinking, what is she talking about? Wasn't this about architecture or neuroscience? Yes, and that's exactly the point. In order to understand how the environment affects us, we first need to know what's going on inside us. I'll tell you how I ended up in the field of neuroscience applied to architecture. It's all my mom's fault. Sorry, Mom. So I was studying architecture, and one day my mom called me. She's a neurologist, and she has always been dealing with autism. So one day she called me, all proud, telling me that she finally managed to open a snoozelen room in the clinic where she was working. I was like, a snooze what? So she explained to me that snoozelen rooms are multisensory spaces that are used as a form of non-pharmacological therapy. So when the patients are feeling very agitated or anxious, instead of giving them strong medications, they can be brought into these spaces. And for me, as an architecture student, that was a light bulb moment. There was an epiphany. I thought, who designed this space? And why does it look like this? Why those colors, those lights, those shapes? So can space heal? Autism can't be cured, but can the physical environment around us reduce the need for medication? So from that moment on, I started doing research, and a whole world of studies opened up to me showing how the physical environment around us has an effect on our minds and our bodies. Today, thanks to science, we know that space is never neutral, but it always has an influence on us. Snoozelen rooms work through multisensory stimulation, which means that they deal with the effects that architecture has on our senses. A couple of months ago, a new article was published from a research that started in 2016 at MIT that links sensory stimulation to Alzheimer's disease. Through a series of experiments, the research shows that exposure to flickering lights and sounds at a frequency of 40 Hz increases the synchrony of the brain waves at that same frequency, 40 Hz, what we call gamma waves, in multiple regions of the brain. This process promotes the release of certain peptides by a particular type of neurons, which in turn promotes the elimination of beta-amyloid plaques, which is the characteristic feature of Alzheimer's disease, through the glymphatic system, which is a sort of hydraulic network that removes the waste from our brain. So in a nutshell, a mechanism has been discovered that through a certain type of light and sound could slow down the cognitive decline caused by Alzheimer's disease. Now, the evidence and the research on humans is still preliminary, but what is interesting is that it seems like there is a correlation between architectural features, light and sound, and such relevant neurological effects. This type of study focuses on the relationship between architecture and the individual, but there is also evidence that shows how space affects social interactions. A research project I'm working on together with the architecture and engineering firm Lombardini 22 and the Institute of Neuroscience of CNR, Consiglio Nazionale delle Ricerche, focuses on proxemics, and specifically on the effects that the size of spaces have on humans. So the research team measured that when the participants of the study were walking along tightening spaces, they experienced a higher psychophysiological activation, which means that they were feeling more aroused, more activated, we could say more stressed. While in the opposite scenario, so when they were walking along an enlarging space, they experienced a lower psychophysiological activation, which means that they were feeling more relaxed. Now you might be thinking, did we really need neuroscience to say that we prefer larger spaces? But if this could seem trivial, what we saw during the experiments in virtual reality, we also measured the brain activity and the eye movement of the participants when they were encountering someone else. And what we measured is that when the participants were coming from a tightening space, so a more high activation architecture, a space that was making them feel more stressed, their eye gaze was focusing more on the body of the person that was appearing in front of them. While in the other scenario, so when they were coming from a larger space, so a more relaxing environment, their eye gaze was focusing more on the face of the person that was appearing in front of them. So the interpretation that we gave to this data is that when we are experiencing a stressful space, a stressful architecture, and a stranger appears in front of us, we immediately want to know if that person could represent a danger, a threat for us, so that we can prepare whether to fight or to escape. While when the architecture in which we are in allows us to be in a more relaxed mental state, then we have more attentional capacity to try to interpret the emotional state of the other. In other words, we have more energy to try to create a social interaction and maybe to even empathize. So in these terms, the famous first impression, it's actually the second impression, because the first one is deeply rooted in the environment where we come from. Today, many people believe that the brain stops developing once we reach adulthood. But that's not true. Our brain has a remarkable capability to grow, adapt, and even rewire that lasts throughout our whole lifetime. This amazing skill of the brain is called neuroplasticity. For instance, in the 2000s, a study shows that the brain of London taxi drivers is different than the brain of non-taxi drivers. So London taxi drivers have a bigger hippocampus compared to non-taxi drivers. The hippocampus is a region of the brain where memory and spatial representation processes take place. So the extraordinary navigation and orientation capabilities required by their job had an influence on the size and the anatomy of the brain. Back in 1947, the Canadian psychologist Donald Hebb introduced the concept of enriched environments, referring to those spaces that trigger both our brains and our social interactions. Enriched environments consist of a series of stimuli that trigger our spatial exploration and curiosity, and that facilitate a constant multisensory, cognitive, motor, and social stimulation. Since then, many studies investigated how these kind of spaces have an impact on our brain structure and function. And today, there is evidence that enriched environments can promote the development of certain sensory systems and even boost neuroplasticity in adults. So, if our brain is shaped by experience and experience is shaped by space, then space has the power to deeply transform us. And that's why the spaces in which we live, where we grow, where we learn, where we heal, where we connect, are so important, both for our personal well-being and for social relationships. So today, what I suggest to you is that we as citizens, creatives, and decision makers embrace the responsibility that comes from this knowledge, and that we demand and create spaces that truly serve humanity. Thank you. Thank you.